So welcome everyone to my talk about model migration. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to introduce Edapt, but not so much from the point of view of a framework developer, but more from the point of view of a framework user. Actually, I'm one of the framework developers now, but I have been a framework user, and Edapt used to be a project which was not very active anymore. About a year ago, we started to use it anyway, because we needed a solution to migrate models. And we took over the project. We took over the project lead and we added 2 more committers to the project. So we kind of revived the project, which I think is a very good example for the open source technology. Because still, if there is no one around to actually take care of the project, you can still take it over and benefit from a lot of existing technology, such as we did. The examples that I have today are not very simple, because they're actual examples from the project where we have been applying Edapt to. But I think they show very well that Edapt can help you a lot with model migration. So first of all, what is the problem of model migration? The typical problem is you define your model with Ecore and EMF, and then you start creating instances of that. So in this example, I have a model with a user and with a task. And if you deploy that application somewhere, your users will start to create instances of that model. So you will have maybe an instance of a user called Maximilian, and he has 2 tasks, the release 1.0 of Edapt and the ECE talk. Now the problem is, that's all good and that's simple to do, and EMF helps you a lot in doing that, but the problem with that is, as soon as you start modifying your model over time, maybe for the 2.0 release, these instances are not valid anymore in terms of the model that you've defined. So now you need to migrate the instances to cope with the new version of your model. How does that happen? I mean, if we look at an example, we have the user entity, and I have an instance of this user entity, and it has a Boolean active that is set to true. Now if I start modifying the model above here, and instead of this active true, I change that to an attribute that is called activity level now, and it's not only true and false anymore, but it's an enumeration. Now this model instance is not valid anymore, because this active true does not conform to the model anymore. So basically they are out of sync. And what I need to do is, I need to trigger a migration on the model instances to change the user and to assign some activity level. In this case, I say, okay, if activity was true, I set the activity level to medium. But this is a manual migration step that you would have to do manually in a normal scenario. And this is exactly what Edapt is about. Edapt is about to help you with that. The example that we're looking at is using Edapt for EMF forms. EMF forms is another Eclipse EMF-based framework, and this framework is about modeling user interfaces. So there is a model for user interfaces. We call that a view model. And as you can imagine, we have designed an Ecore for the view model at some point in time, but for later revisions of EMF forms, we wanted to change things because we discovered that some things are missing, that we wanted to move some of the attributes into other classes, and so on. The problem that we had right now, of course, is that people had already been using EMF forms. They had created view models, and they had a whole bunch of instances of that view models we would not even know. And these view models would no longer conform to newer versions of the EMF forms tooling. So either we had to tell people that they should now redo all the view models, or we had to offer some kind of migration. What EMF forms, by the way, does is it combines this domain model and the view model and creates a user interface for you. But what we are looking at is only the view model today and how to migrate that view model and how we did that with Edapt. And that's already demo time, so I'm going to show you in my IDE how that looks like. So what we have in EMF forms to actually view the view models, we have this editor. And as soon as the editor opens up, we want to trigger the migration if there is a need for a migration. This is the code. It might look a little bit complicated, but actually it's not. You have a check here that finds out whether this model is outdated, whether it needs a migration. For Edapt, the migration is triggered by the URIs that are in this XMI file which stores the model. So if the URI in the stored model is older than the URI in your actually deployed model, then a migration is necessary. If a migration is necessary in this code, we will bring up a dialog to warn the user that we're going to migrate the model. And if the user agrees with that, we are actually performing the migration. The migration is performed in a so-called migrator. In the default usage of Edapt, this migrator can be generated. But in the use that we have for EMF forms, we needed to adapt the migrator a little bit because EMF forms consists of many, many Ecores. So we have about, I think, 15 different Ecores that are independent of each other because it's very modular. And to cope with that, we created our own migrator, which is in this class with about a couple of 100 lines of code. And actually, it's an extension to Edapt to handle multiple Ecores. Now, what I will do is I opened up here an instance of an Eclipse, such as it would be deployed to our users, and users will have view models in their IDE. I have 2 example view models in here. I didn't open up the view model with the view model editor right now because I want to show you how the view model is outdated at this point in time. If you look at that, the view model here has an attribute that is called container layout embedding, and it's set to true. And it's for a group. And if we switch back to the Ecore here, this is the Ecore that actually describes how the group should look like, and you can see that this attribute no longer exists. We have removed this attribute in the succeeding version, and instead of that attribute, we've introduced something that is called group type, which is an enumeration, and it has 3 different values. And formally, if this former Boolean was set to true, we want to set the group type to embedded, and otherwise we will set the group type to normal. And this is the kind of migration that we want to perform. If you haven't ever used Edapt, you might wonder what this down below here is. This is a normal Ecore editor up here, but what Edapt does, if you have the Edapt tooling installed into your IDE, it adds a history to every Ecore file. And actually this history records what you have been changing on the Ecore. And this is the artifact that is being used for generating these automatic migrators. So if you look at that history, there's a former release there, 130, and there is the release 140, which is our latest release. And in this release, you can, if you unfold it, you can see what has changed here. So as an example, here we have created a new attribute in group, in the E-class group, which is called collapsed, and it is of type Boolean. And every change you do in the Ecore is getting recorded in this history. What I've already done for the first example that I'm going to show is I've already generated the migrator from that. And the migrator has been installed into this Eclipse instance that I'm running here. And what I hope that the migrator will do is it will get rid of this attribute because it doesn't exist anymore, and it will introduce the new attribute, the group type attribute, and set it accordingly, so set it to embedded. If I now open this view model with the actual view model editor that was shipped with EMF forms, it's going to warn me, as we saw in the code, that the view model is not up to date, and if we want to update to the latest version. And if I do that now, the migration is being triggered, and now the view model is open. This is the actual editor, and you can see in the editor that the group type is set to embedded. So it has been migrated. We don't see, and the model loaded correctly, otherwise the editor would basically crash. And if we look back into the serialized model, we can now see that it has been changed and it updated, and now the new attribute is in there.
Can you code the variety? Because I'm wondering where the version is that you mentioned.
Oh yeah. This is the URI. Oops. Yeah. This is the URI of the group Ecore, and this URI formerly was 130 and now is 140. So the approach that Edapt takes is that you encode the version number into the URI of your model, which is a good idea anyway, so that also other tools can detect that your model is actually updated and is different from the previous model. That answers the question, right? Yes, okay. Good. Now for the second example, I'm actually going to change something in an Ecore. We are going to look at the history, how it changes. We are going to create the migrator ourselves. So we're going through all the steps that are actually necessary to do. We are going to do this in this Ecore, which is yet another Ecore of the EMF Forms project. This Ecore defines a so-called table control. And this table control has already in the previous version, we added a new attribute which is called detail editing. And it is an enumeration with 3 values. Either there's no detail editing, or there's a detail editing with dialog or with a panel. Unfortunately, what we didn't really forget, it was at the time where we didn't have Edapt, so we didn't dare to remove the old attribute. And in the new revision, we dared to remove this attribute, this outdated attribute. It's called enable detail editing dialog. And it's kind of superfluous because the detailed editing enumeration has the same kind of information in that. So what we want to do is we want to first delete enable detail editing dialog, this attribute. And then we want to make sure that we set this enumeration attribute up here to with dialog if and only if this Boolean was enabled before. So what I'm going to do right now is exactly what we've done for the last release. We have deleted this attribute. So I'm just working with the Ecore editor now, and I'm going to delete the attribute. Now note that below here this was recorded in the history. So I can now see in the history that the E attribute enable detail editing dialog has been deleted from table control. And it has been recorded into a node that is called release, which is not yet released because we haven't released it yet. Okay, I'm going to save that. If I would now generate the migrators and run them, what Edapt would do is it would remove instances of that attribute from the view models. The problem with that is that I want them removed, yes, but I also want the detail editing attribute, which is new, to be correctly updated. And that is something that Edapt cannot automatically do for me because there is some semantic in there. But for that, Edapt offers a mechanism which is called custom migration steps. So in addition to the migration that is automatically triggered because you changed something in the Ecore, you can also add migration steps. So I'm going to do that now. Right-click on the step and say attach custom migration to changes. It'll ask me where I want to put this, which class actually implements this custom migration. I'm going to put this into a different plugin, and I'm going to use the plugin's default package. And then I'm going to create this custom migrator class. Actually, I've already prepared the migrator, so I'm just opening it up. How does such a custom migrator look like? Each migrator has to implement 2 methods. The first method is the method before the actual migration step, so that is before this attribute, the enable detail editing dialog attribute has been removed from the meta model, and another step after it has been removed. And the before step is quite simple. We just retrieve the removed attributes before it is actually being removed. And then in the second step, we are going to let Edapt get us all instances of type table control. So you can see that Edapt also helps you with iterating over the existing model. And once I have all these instances, I'm going to get the actual value of that detail editing attribute. So that is the value that it had before. I'm going to unset the value, and then I'm going to set the value for detail editing in case it was true to detail editing with dialog. Otherwise, I'm not going to do anything. So based on the old value of enable detail editing dialog, which was a Boolean, based on that, I'm going to set this enumeration attribute down here. That's the only custom migration set. What is kind of implicit is that once this custom migration is completed, Edapt will also remove the old attribute from the old model. Good. What I need to do now, just to make that work, is I will have to change the name to this already existing class. I think it was table CM, hopefully. And save that. So now I have a history with some recorded operation that was deleting this Boolean, and an additional attached custom migration, which is about migrating values. And what I want to do next is I want to actually make this migration available for the tooling, for the EMF forms tooling. And in order to do so, I have to actually release this history. So if you do an actual release of your software, you also release the version history that Edapt created here. So I'm going to hit release. And the first thing that Edapt asks me is, how do I want to update the namespace URI? We have seen before that the namespace URI was 140 at the end, which identified the old release, and the new release that we did at this point in time was 041, was a service release, and I let Edapt change the namespace URI to 041. Now you can see that the release is no longer not released. It's completed now, and what I need to do now, not because of Edapt, but just because of EMF, is I've changed the table Ecore, and I haven't generated the code yet, so I will need to regenerate my model code. I also have an edit plugin, so I'll regenerate that as well. And now I'm done. What happens now is that the custom migration is registered with Edapt by an extension, and Edapt is being able to pick that up, and it's going to pick that up because it sees that the current URI of my model is 140, that the currently deployed model is 141, so it figures out that it needs to use these migration steps. I'm going to relaunch the IDE tooling. Yeah, but the view models, and I'm going to open up the table view model here as an example. And we can see that in this instance of table control, enable detail editing dialog as an attribute is still there. It's set to true. If we look at the URI, we don't see it. Oh, it's without, yeah. Oh, that's that's even more a specialty, because we didn't start with Edapt at first. The first revision of every model didn't have a version number in there, so the version number would only come with the first release of that. So it's no, if you don't use Edapt yet, it's no problem if you start with a package URI without the version number. Just make sure that with the first new release, you add a version number to distinguish it somehow from the old release. Okay, and now if I open up this with the actual view model editor, it's going to ask me again if I want to migrate. If I want to migrate to the latest version, it's going to migrate. And if I now bring that up in the editor, you can see that this attribute detailed editing is set to with dialog. And we can also see that if we look at the serialization, that the serialization has been updated accordingly.
And in this case, it also did all the previous migrations.
Yeah.
More than one migration.
So it is no problem if you migrate over multiple steps, because Edapt is going to figure out the package URI version of the source version, so to say. So that is what's actually serialized onto disk. And it's going to compare that with the target version. That is what you've actually deployed in terms of a plugin. And it's going in series to apply all steps to upgrade gradually. The longer you upgrade, of course, the longer the migration takes, if it involves more steps, but it can upgrade through different versions. Yeah, good question. Good, that's actually the demo already. More information on Edapt you can find on the webpage. Edapt has been in incubation for a very long time. Actually, I think because the project leadership was not that active anymore, because I know of several customers which actually use Edapt in production. Finally, it's now, due to the change in the project leadership, it's now graduating. It's graduating on November 7th. Actually, yesterday we already had the final release candidate, so it looks very promising. The release contains what was there, so we didn't add any feature. What is already there is the tooling that you've seen. So it's this history tooling, so that in the Ecore editor you see the history and you can attach custom migrations. What I maybe didn't show in the tooling, this is very interesting, is apart from custom migrations, on the right-hand side you can see here in the so-called operation browsers, there is already a number of operations available that are kind of like refactoring operations. So for example, a refactoring operations that is available is pulling an attribute over an association into another class. So for some of the more complicated migrations where you would actually normally need to write a custom migration, there is packaged operations already available, which makes it even simpler. So this is the tooling for design time, and there's the Edapt runtime. The Edapt runtime is responsible for picking up all registered migrators and for offering an API to the tool so that you can actually check, is a migration necessary? If yes, then please trigger a migration. And you can, with the runtime, also do a lot of more things, like we have, for example, done to actually handle the multiple independent Ecores that we have that still occur in one instance. This is the Edapt website. There is a simple tutorial on the website as well, which is much simpler than the example that I've shown if you want to get into details how to use Edapt. And finally, if you like the talk, please provide us with feedback on the webpage, as always. Thank you very much. So I guess we have plenty of time for questions. Go ahead.
Okay, regarding the history stuff. So
yeah.
Why is it the history and not like a sort of a diff between versions? You know what I mean?
It is sort of a diff. If you look at it, I mean, basically this says that it has been deleted. So this is the difference between the previous and the later version.
What if I just, if there is redundant changes, like I delete by accident and I add again, what would happen?
It will, in some limits, it will normalize the differences.
Like it cancels, right?
Yeah. But within limits. If you have like a complex operation and a series of basic operations that make up for the complex operations, I think it won't discover it. But in general, it does try to normalize the operations. What is also available as tooling, which has been there, is that you can, if you haven't used Edapt, so you have an old version and a new version of your Ecore, but you haven't recorded it, then you don't have this history. And there's a tool which allows you to regenerate the history by diffing the two Ecore instances. The problem, or the technical reason why it doesn't use diffing in the first place, is that some of the changes are difficult to reconstruct because you want to understand how the change exactly happened. You don't want to just know that someone deleted an attribute and created a new attribute. You want to know that this attribute was actually renamed, because then you migrate the values. So for Edapt, there's a difference between deleting and creating something and renaming it. And that's why the history needs to be recorded, actually, to make it easier to have an automated migration.
This tooling you mentioned, is it somehow smart that it also provides an interactive mode where I can select that there was a renaming?
Yeah. So what you actually do is you get always the difference and you try to close the difference by applying operations until the difference is 0. Yeah.
So you have shown the usage for persistence within files, but how does it integrate to persistent handlers like CDO or CNAO when it comes to data?
Yeah. It's a very good question. It doesn't.
All right. That's a pity.
What I've seen, like in actual practical use cases, is that people would even export stuff, for example, for CDO, into the XML format to be able to migrate it with Edapt. The problem is that Edapt is very much tied to the persistence because it needs to be able to read in stuff with an old Ecore version. And if you have a tool like CDO and you've changed the Ecore already, CDO will tell you that this doesn't match anymore. In case of CDO, if you have a database backend, things are even more complicated because actually you would need to generate a schema changes to make up for the Ecore changes. So I think currently the best way to cope with changes in your Ecore, if you persisted not in an XMI, is actually, and unfortunately, to export it to XMI, migrate it there, and write it back. Yeah.
What about going back? I mean, the default operations, I hope, are supported for custom migration in the future. How does it work?
It doesn't go back.
Okay.
Yeah. For the default operations, as you assumed, it's actually right. They are reversible, but the custom migrations, it's people, or we decided that people would probably not like to implement forward and reverse.
As long as the next release actually is the best.
Yeah. Well, that's why the warning is there. Are you sure you want to use the new release? Go ahead.
So you do this release when you do an actual release?
Yeah.
But I guess during development, or in my team, I'm doing several of these steps, and not all of them at once, but I still want all of them to have the current development state. And if they have their custom models on their systems, I need to migrate up to the start. Is this somehow supported?
Yeah, I mean, it's no problem if you do, let's say, an internal beta release or something like that, as long as you make sure that once you do the final release, you have yet another version number. Because then it corresponds to your question, then Edapt will just migrate from the last productive version over the intermediate beta versions, maybe, up to the final version. That's actually what we also do for testing. You need it. So you already do a release. It's just not a public release. You also have it in the history. And then when you have the final release, you do another release. Another possibility is if you don't like the cluttering of the history with all your intermediate version, you can rearrange the steps. So you can just move them up into, when you do the final release, into the final release. The problem with that is only that all your testers that have the intermediate, they are not updated anymore then. So, but it's very doable.
When you read in an old model, where do you take the old Ecore from? Do you deploy it?
It's stored it's reconstructed kind of from the history. So it is the old Ecore, but only as an Ecore and without the generated code is available to Edapt, and that is how it interprets the old XMI. Yeah.
One question for better understanding. So in my development environment, I will have this kind of Ecore extension, also the editor
Yes.
extension. So if I have a separate RCP application, I will have some kind of libraries inside.
Yeah, the Edapt runtime.
And then I can use in my own RCP application this complete automatic mechanism.
Exactly. So in the runtime, you have the Edapt runtime and the migration plugins that you've generated with the tooling, because they contain information about the migration steps that are necessary and the old Ecores, how they looked like and all that kind of things. So typically you have one additional plugin in your application that is the migration Edapt plugin.
It's stable for productive.
We use it in production actually, yeah. I would other users that actually use it. I've talked to them, but they are not interested in providing any feedback. There's actually even binary changes that seem to be out there so that people have adapted it. So it seems to work for other people, but probably they also have put some additional work in there, like we did, that it works for the multiple Ecores. Unfortunately, they haven't given it back yet, so yeah. Yeah.
Is there some integration with fixed text, so is it possible to migrate fixed text DSL models? Because that would be really cool.
I would like to comment on this one.
Yeah, that's good, because I don't know.
So with Xtext, you actually only need this if you change the syntax of your grammar. Yeah. If you change the Ecore model behind your grammar, you do not need the migration at all because your language will still be able to parse the old files to do your new Ecore. So that's why there are a lot of changes that you can do without needing to do the migration.
It's actually maybe a good comment anyway. If you use the XMI serialization of EMF, there's a lot of changes that are backward compatible. So for example, adding a new attribute without the need to migrate some values into the new attribute, that's backward compatible. Or also upgrading multiplicities is backward compatible. So you don't need the migration in all the cases, but definitely there is cases where you need a migration for simple things like just renaming an attribute. This one.
Is there some kind of error support? So if the migration gets stuck at some point?
Yeah, there's output to there's log output that tells you that it failed, but basically it's a Boolean, so it says you.
There's not some kind of fallback that says, okay, migration failed, better don't apply it at all?
Or it doesn't save the migration if it fails. So if it fails, the file is still stuck at the old version.
So there's no, okay, so probably it's hard to have
Yeah.
tooling which can do anything, but
Yeah.
maybe somebody had a very good idea.
No, that's why I'm saying that you should do the testing also, that if you have an actual release, what we do for EMF forms, we have a folder where we have a bunch of view model files with all the different things that we have, and we just run that. Because, I mean, it's not so much the framework sometimes you forget to, I don't know, release a history for one of the Ecores, and unless you have a file that actually contains entities of that Ecore, you don't notice that it doesn't work.
Can you detail a bit on the operation browser? Because you just went over it.
Okay, yeah. So, for example, what I've done before, I've deleted something here. You can also do that from the operation browser.
Okay,
So it has all the, yeah. And maybe an interesting operation that you can do there is, you can, for example, do an inline class. So if you have a one-to-one relationship to another class, you can pull in all the attributes from the other class into your own class, like a refactoring. The same you can do extract class. But what the good thing about that is it not only moves the attribute, it also migrates all the values.
But so if I do the operations through the browser,
Yeah.
they will lead to safer upgrades, right?
Exactly. So for some of the things that you do, like if you would do an inline class, if you do it manually, you would delete the class, including all the attributes, and then recreate the attributes in the existing class. And for Edapt, that would mean that it would delete all the values with an automatic migration because it seems that this class was just deleted.
Okay.
Now, if you apply this with the operation browser, it would actually migrate the values.
And one more related question. The one you just did, the migration, the manual, we just called it, the table CM.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say that some sort of migrations, they fit into some kind of common patterns, like
Yeah.
This true implies that, and
Mhm.
stuff with values typically. Wouldn't it be like nice to have, like, instead of coding it, to have at least for the general cases to just, integrate it with
Yeah, sure. And for some of the things, there is operations in the operation browser, and it's extensible, so you can contribute new operations. So let's say that in your project, you often have exactly the case that I have. You have a Boolean, you convert it to an enum, and the true always corresponds to a certain value in the enumeration. You could have an operation for that that is just packaged into the operation browser, so you don't have to rewrite that every time. Yeah.
If you don't add customization with own code, is there a mode where you can just give Edapt the history file and then it interprets and does the migration stuff without generating a migrator, for example?
But generating migrator is actually already too much. It actually, if you hit the release button, it also only marks this release as being released, and it is interpreted at runtime. Okay. So actually at runtime, it reads in this history, and from that derives what the steps are that you need to do.
So there is no need to generate code?
No, there's no code generated in this sense, no. There's an extension generated that registers this history, but that's it.
Is there an automatic mechanism in the runtime to update all files in the workspace?
No, no, unfortunately not, no. So it's always the editor or using framework that triggers the migrator to say, okay, please update this. Okay.
I've seen a GMF operation, and my question is about EMF connection.
You've seen a
GMF operation on your browser, and my question is about traditional editing domain. And it works well with EMF connection.
Actually, when it loads the resources and saves it, it works with its own resource set, so it's not involved with any transactional editing domain, because everything it does, it writes back into the file, and then when the editor actually opens, the editor will again deserialize with the updated file format. So it's not integrated with the resource set or editing domain of your editor. Okay. I think I'm running out of time anyway, or are we good? Kind of. Okay, one more question.
Can I use offload Edapt if I define the model using Ecore?
I would think so, yeah, because you still have an Ecore. Probably you can answer that better.
Actually, you said that you can recreate history based on a diff.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, if you load an Ecore file, the resource will, if you load an export file, the resource will also contain the Ecore
Okay.
of that export
Yeah.
file.
So then it should be compatible.
It's not on index 0, but
Mhm.
on index 1, so the tooling can handle that, and you create history manually. So
When I just think that it's,
it would work.
yeah, from a usability point of view, you just have to recreate the history every time, so probably it's simpler to use the Ecore editor because then it gets recorded. But yeah. Okay, thank you very much.